In the high shadow of the Andes, where clouds hang low and silence can feel heavier than stone, there lingers a name carried by whispers rather than songs. Pedro López. He was not a ghost, yet he moved like one, through crowded markets, through dusty plazas, through borders that never noticed his passing. Mothers warned their children of him, the way old tales warn of rivers and jaguars. But this story was not folklore. They say the ground itself remembers that if you press your ear to the soil in Ambato or Ayacucho, you can still hear the faint echoes of laughter cut short, swallowed by earth. Hundreds of children vanished into that silence. And when the man who took them finally spoke, the world recoiled. Not because his words were unbelievable, but because the bones proved him right. He became El Monstruo de los Andes, a title too large, too mythic, for a man so ordinary. And perhaps that's the most frightening part. There was nothing extraordinary about him at all. Imagine stumbling across a confession so vast, so absurd, that your instinct is to laugh, because the alternative is too horrifying to process. In 1980, a quiet, wiry man sat in a police station in Ambato, Ecuador. His name, Pedro Alonso López. He didn't scream. He didn't boast. He simply told them, matter of fact, like he was reporting rainfall, that he had taken the lives of more than 300 children across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. The officers thought he was joking. People confess to terrible things all the time, but this, a single man claiming hundreds of victims? Impossible. The math didn't make sense. The human imagination rejected it. But then López said something chillingly specific. He offered to lead them to a mass grave. He described the riverbeds, the shallow earth, the eerie silence of places where laughter had been cut short. And when police followed him out into highlands, spades sinking into damp soil, tiny bones surfaced, one after another, row upon row, a nightmare exhumed under open sky. Even the most hardened investigators froze, because in that moment, the ridiculous became real, the impossible gained weight, and Pedro López, this unremarkable man with sunken eyes and a quiet voice, forced the world to consider the existence of a predator unlike anything in recorded history. Not a legend, not a rumor, but a man who blended into crowded streets and marketplaces, watching, selecting, vanishing into the chaos with his chosen prey. The newspapers struggled with the headline. Some called him El Monstruo de los Andes. Others refused to print the numbers at all, worried it would seem like tabloid fiction. But the bones didn't lie. And López wasn't finished talking. He spoke of his methods without shame, describing a cycle of abduction and destruction with the same tone someone else might use to describe fixing a car. His voice was steady. His eyes, some said, were empty, like he was already elsewhere, reliving his own personal theater of shadows. Here's the dreadful question that has haunted South America ever since. Was Pedro López truly the most prolific killer the modern world has ever known? Or was he a liar, an exaggerator, a twisted man who inflated his cruelty to monstrous myth? The earth gave up its bones, yes, but never all of them. And every number attached to his name is a wound in the dark, gaping, uncertain, festering. We begin, then, not with certainty, but with unease. Because in the strange, shifting legacy of Pedro López, truth itself becomes slippery, distorted, and maybe, just maybe, as predatory as the man himself. The Andes are a strange place to bury horror. Mountains that scrape the clouds, valleys swallowed by mist, marketplaces exploding with color. Life here has always danced between survival and spectacle. Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru in the 1970s were worlds of contradictions. Dictatorships and democracies, ancient traditions and creeping modernity, religious fervor and urban poverty. Children darted through plazas, clutching sweets or trinkets sold by their mothers. Vendors shouted prices over the chaos of bus horns and caged chickens. For outsiders, it was dizzying. For locals, it was life. But lurking beneath this color was fragility. Families lived hand to mouth, often with half a dozen children under one corrugated roof. Disappearances were not tracked with the rigor of Western police blotters, especially not when the missing were poor, rural, or female. Authorities often dismissed reports with shrugs. She probably ran away. She must have gone to the city. The invisibility of the poor gave predators camouflage. And yet, the danger wasn't only institutional neglect. The 1970s in South America were a tapestry woven with civil unrest. Guerrilla groups roamed the countryside. Military regimes justified brutality in the name of stability. There were rumors of cartels rising, of cross-border crimes swelling like a bruise. Against this backdrop, the loss of a single child, unless that child belonged to a wealthy or politically connected, barely registered as a crime worth solving. That's the cruelty of context. It doesn't excuse what happened, but it explains how someone like Pedro Lopez could operate in plain sight. Imagine a man walking through a dusty market, offering cheap gifts, whispering promises of candy or toys. In another world, he might have been chased out by suspicious parents. But in this world, where hunger gnawed at daily life, children were accustomed to wandering, to taking risks. Some were even pushed toward strangers who looked like they had coins in their pockets. Religion cloaked the society with hope and dread in equal measure. Statues of the Virgin stood at intersections, candles burned in shrines, and sermons echoed with warnings about sin and temptation. But faith, powerful as it was, could not stop the undercurrent of fear. A generation of parents whispered prayers not just for food or work, but that their children would come home after running errands in the market. When bones finally rose from the ground, the world gasped. But for decades before, the soil of the Andes had already been absorbing the missing, uncounted, unnamed. What made Lopez possible wasn't just his appetite for destruction. It was a society too fractured, too desperate, and too distracted to notice the trail he left behind. Pedro Alonso López, a name that sounds almost forgettable, like a character buried on page 70 of a crime novel. Yet behind it lived a childhood so grotesque. It reads like a laboratory experiment in how to manufacture a monster. Born in 1948 in Colombia, he never knew peace, never knew stability. His father, a violent man involved in guerrilla conflict, was killed before Lopez could form memories. His mother, a sex worker in a turbulent city, raised him amid the chaos of clients, poverty, and constant neglect. Neglect is too polite a word, though. Lopez himself would later recall his mother beating him, throwing him out, leaving him to survive on the streets before he even reached adolescence. By age 8, he was wandering Bogota's alleyways like a ghost child, scavenging food, dodging predators, until inevitably he became prey himself. He spoke of being taken by a man, abused, discarded. Imagine a child trying to process that trauma without guidance, without care, without even language for what had happened. Instead of healing, he calcified. Here's the first red flag, the one society missed. Lopez didn't retreat into silence. He grew to crave power over vulnerability, a reversal of his own suffering. His early crimes were petty, stealing food, pickpocketing, drifting, but his mind was already rehearsing darker scripts. He fantasized about domination, about inflicting the kind of helplessness he'd tasted. The seed was planted, and no one stopped it. There's a temptation, almost dangerous, to romanticize his brokenness as destiny. The abused becomes the abuser. The cycle repeats. But listen closely. Lopez wasn't just broken. He was purposeful. By his teens, he claimed to have been recruited into a gang, honing his manipulative streak, learning how fear could be leveraged. He briefly vanished into institutions, correctional schools, prisons, but always emerged harder, meaner, more cunning. One story from his youth stands out. At age 12, he was taken in by an American family. For a brief flicker of time, there was hope, discipline, food, perhaps even love. But he fled, claiming he'd been mistreated again. Some say he simply couldn't adapt to structure. That chaos had already rewired him. Others whisper that he couldn't survive without shadows. By adulthood, Lopez had transformed into something paradoxical. Outwardly nondescript, inwardly volcanic, short, unassuming, often polite to strangers, he was exactly the sort of man you wouldn't notice in a crowd. And that was his camouflage. A man invisible enough to walk hand in hand with children through bustling markets without raising suspicion. The Andes did not give us a demon with horns. They gave us Pedro. Ordinary face, ordinary build, extraordinary darkness. He didn't need to look frightening. The true terror was that he looked like no one at all. It always begins quietly, doesn't it? Not with headlines or police sirens, but with the absence of sound. The chair at the dinner table left empty, the bed where no one returns to sleep. In the early 1970s, in the mountain towns of Colombia, whispers began about little girls who simply vanished. One moment, they were chasing each other in the marketplace, or sent by mothers to fetch bread, or skipping stones by a riverbank. The next, nothing. A gap in the noise of life. At first, no one made a connection. Children went missing all the time in these regions, runaways, kidnappings by desperate men, recruitment by armed groups. Poverty taught families to brace for loss. But these disappearances had a strange consistency. The victims were always girls, usually between 8 and 12 years old, always poor, always unseen by the state. The first disturbances didn't look like a storm. They looked like scattered raindrops. In one Colombian town, a fruit vendor swore he saw a stranger, a wiry man with hollow cheeks, talking sweetly to a young girl by a stall. The girl giggled, then followed. Neither returned. In another town, bones surfaced in a shallow grave near a dried river, but no investigation followed. The authorities shrugged and called it an isolated tragedy. But by the mid-1970s, mothers began to notice patterns. My neighbor's daughter went missing too, one said, in the same market. Priests began to mutter warnings in their sermons. Beware the strangers, beware the smiling men who promise sweets. And still, nothing official was done. These warnings belonged to the realm of gossip, not law. There was one story, whispered years later, of a mother who caught Lopez in the act. He had lured her daughter away with a toy. The mother confronted him, screaming, clawing, forcing him to flee into the crowd. She saved her child that day, but who believed her? Just another hysterical woman in a marketplace. Lopez disappeared into another town, another market, another group of children too hungry and curious to resist his lure. This is a cruelty of the first disturbance. The world doesn't recognize it as disturbance at all. It sees it as background noise, the unfortunate static of poor communities. Only later, when bones are counted and graves unearthed, does the world look back and say, that was the beginning. For the families in those towns, oh, it wasn't the beginning of a mystery. It was the end of a future. One child at a time, laughter drained from the valleys of the Andes. And Pedro Lopez grew bolder, certain that the silence of authorities was his greatest ally. By the late 1970s, something was festering beneath the Andes that no one wanted to name out loud. Missing children had become more than occasional tragedies. They were a drumbeat, steady and unrelenting. Markets emptied not just of produce, but of trust. Parents clutched their daughters tighter, muttering prayers as though faith itself could pin them to the earth. And still, girls disappeared. The numbers didn't make sense. In Peru alone, over 100 cases piled up in less than 2 years, all strikingly similar. The press flirted with the story, but officials swatted it down, terrified of admitting they had lost control. Instead, the whispers travel by word of mouth. There's a man, he takes them. The bogeyman was no longer a tale to scare children into obedience. It was an unspoken reality creeping through villages. Police reports, when they existed at all, clashed with local accounts. Some claimed the disappearances were the work of human traffickers. Others blamed wandering guerrillas or black market organ harvesters. Anything but the simpler, darker truth that one man might be systematically preying on hundreds of children, slipping through borders like water between fingers. And here's where the mystery grew grotesque. Lopez himself wasn't hiding in some dark cave. He was moving openly, boarding buses, walking dusty roads, even attending local fairs. In Ambato, Ecuador, vendors remembered him smiling faintly, watching children with unnerving calm. But to adults, he seemed harmless, almost timid. Imagine the sick irony. While communities whisper a phantom, the phantom was buying bread right beside them. The public began to invent explanations, because the mind recoils from enormity. Some swore it was a work of witches, stealing children for rituals. Others whispered about demons disguised as men, wandering the Andes with insatiable appetites. When faced with horror too big to grasp, mythology rushes in to fill the void. But there were cracks in silence. In one Peruvian town, several bodies were discovered along a riverbed, buried with mechanical precision, each grave the same depth, each girl roughly the same age. Someone had a system. Someone had turned killing into routine. And yet, no manhunt followed. No urgent investigation crossed borders. The girls remained statistics, and the Andean wind carried their stories away like ash. This is the cruelty of mysteries too large. The truth doesn't vanish because it's hidden. It vanishes because no one dares look directly at it. And in that darkness, Pedro Lopez grew into legend, his crimes so vast they seemed implausible, almost fictional, which made them easier, perversely, to ignore. When the weight of missing children finally pressed too heavily on the Andes to be ignored, the investigations began, not as coordinated efforts, but as a patchwork of frantic local responses. Police in Ecuador chased rumors. Peru's authorities filed paperwork that gathered dust. Colombia muttered denials. Borders in South America are porous, and Lopez used them like trapdoors, slipping from one jurisdiction to the next, leaving each country convinced the problem belonged to someone else. Then came the break, almost absurd in its simplicity. In 1980, in Ambato, Ecuador, vendors noticed a man trying to lure a little girl away from the market. His method was predictable now. Soft voice, a cheap trinket, a promise of sweets. But this time he was caught. Furious townspeople dragged him to the police before he could vanish. His name? Pedro Lopez. At first, the authorities didn't realize who they had. He was just another man accused of attempted abduction. But under questioning, Lopez cracked, or perhaps he wanted to. He confessed, not to one crime, not to 10, but to hundreds. His words must have felt like hallucinations, like the fevered dream of a detective too tired to separate fact from fantasy. He described grave sites with surgical clarity. He named the regions. He even detailed how he would choose children, alone, distracted, pliable. Theories exploded like wildfire. Was he exaggerating? Was he covering for a larger network? Could one man possibly account for so much loss? Journalists scoffed. Comparing him to a South American bogeyman conjured to terrify parents into vigilance. Others, more horrified, believed him entirely. The police, perhaps half out of disbelief and half out of desperation, tested him. They brought him to rural grave sites he described. And there in the cold earth, bones appeared, small skulls, tiny ribs, remnants of dresses long rotted. Lopez didn't hesitate. He pointed them out like a tour guide of despair, narrating his private theater of cruelty. Suddenly, the theories about exaggeration fell hollow, but still, Contradictions lingered. If he had truly taken 300 lives, where were all the bodies? Why hadn't someone noticed sooner? Could the institutions of three nations really have failed so catastrophically? Each unanswered question left room for doubt, and Lopez thrived in that space. To some, he was a liar with blood on his hands. To others, he was a monster so efficient the human mind refused to calculate his ledger. The investigation uncovered another bitter truth. The Andean justice systems weren't equipped for him. They could arrest him. Yes, they could even secure confessions. But what punishment fits the scale of such horror? The very notion of justice shriveled under the weight of his words. There's always that moment in stories like this when reality buckles, when you think, surely this is where justice finally slams its fist on the table. For Pedro Lopez, that moment came in the Ecuadorian courtroom. Picture it. Rows of grieving families, journalists buzzing like flies, and in the center, this thin, calm man, speaking about hundreds of stolen lives as though reciting grocery lists. The court convicted him in 1983. 300 victims had been whispered, but only about 50 could be proven well enough for the legal machine to process. 50, even that number, reduced and sanitized, made him one of the most prolific child killers in recorded history. The sentence? Life behind bars? No, Ecuador didn't even have life imprisonment. The maximum penalty at the time, 16 years. 16 years. You could serve longer for smuggling the wrong cargo across the border than for extinguishing dozens of children's futures. Here's where the story breaks down into surrealism. Lopez accepted the sentence with eerie calm. He served time in Ambato prison, reportedly behaving almost model inmate-like. Polite, quiet, cooperative. Guards even described him as well-mannered. Imagine the dissonance. The man they nicknamed El Monstruo de los Andes reading newspapers peacefully in a cell, while parents outside clutched photographs of their missing children. And then came the twist no one wanted to believe. In 1994, after serving his sentence, Pedro Lopez was released. Yes, released. Authorities in Ecuador claimed they had no legal framework to hold him longer. A monster measured in triple digits walked out the prison gates with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his legend. Colombia tried to intervene. He was extradited briefly and put on trial again, but bureaucracy tangled itself into knots. Psychiatric evaluations declared him insane. He was committed to a mental hospital, and then in 1998, he was quietly released once more, as though the world had collectively shrugged and said, "We don't know what to do with him. Let's just let him go." This was the breakdown. The justice system collapsed under its own limits, unable to fathom crimes so large they warped the law itself. And into that legal vacuum stepped the most terrifying possibility of all, that Pedro Lopez, even after confessing to hundreds of children's deaths, was free. The public reeled. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter. Rumors spread of Lopez seen in small towns, in marketplaces again, blending into the chaos. Officials denied it. But denials do not keep nightmares at bay. Resolution is supposed to taste like closure, like a lock snapping shut. But with Pedro Lopez, it never came. His release didn't end the story. It twisted it into something even more grotesque. After 1998, his trail went cold. No prison walls, no hospital records, no watchful eye of the state. Just disappearance. The irony bites. The man who confessed to vanishing hundreds of children simply vanished himself. Rumors multiplied, each more unhinged than the last. Some swore he'd slipped into Colombia's chaos, hiding among guerrillas or drifting through violent border towns. Others claimed he was spotted in remote Peruvian villages, still lingering near markets, still scanning for prey. But without evidence, these were just whispers and fog. Then came the darker speculation. What if he had never stopped? What if his confession wasn't past tense, but merely a pause, an intermission? If his number of victims was already in the hundreds, how many more were added once freedom was handed back to him like a gift? It's a question authorities have never dared to answer, because answering means counting the uncountable. And yet, there's a competing theory that haunts the story. Some criminologists argue López exaggerated, that he inflated his crimes for infamy, and that the confirmed remains, though devastating, did not match his astronomical claims. Was he a cunning liar, feeding on notoriety as hungrily as anything else? Or was he telling the plain, awful truth, that the Andes were littered with bones no one cared enough to count? The haunting part is that both versions are terrifying. If he lied, then justice systems across 3 nations still bungled the cases of dozens of murdered children, letting him slip free. If he told the truth, then the world allowed the worst predator of the 20th century to walk away, smiling at the weakness of human institutions. So where does the story end? With his disappearance, López became both man and myth, an urban legend told to frighten children into staying close to home, a specter for parents who never stopped scanning the crowd, just in case the wiry man with sunken eyes was back. Resolution? No. Lingering questions? Only, because the Andean winds still whisper the same dread. Was Pedro López truly finished, or is he still out there, hiding in the ordinary face of some nameless passerby? What remains after a figure like Pedro López drifts off the map? Not justice, not safety. What lingers is something heavier, an invisible scar stretching across 3 nations. In Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, parents began holding their children tighter in markets. Mothers became suspicious of every stranger who so much as smiled. Communities that once let kids run barefoot and wild through plazas began folding on themselves, swallowed by paranoia. The case exposed the fragility of entire legal systems. How could a man confess to hundreds of deaths and still walk free? International organizations seize on the López story as an example of why reforms were desperately needed. Uniform sentencing laws, better cross-border cooperation, more rigorous handling of missing person cases. Yet change was glacial. Governments preferred silence over shame. To acknowledge López fully would have meant acknowledging decades of failure. And so, his legacy grew more spectral than institutional. In true crime circles, his name hovers near the top of lists, a benchmark for evil, though always paired with doubt. Some scholars treat him like a mythic creature, El Monstruo de los Andes, rather than a man of flesh and blood. Others argue his story is the most damning indictment imaginable of poverty's invisibility, that hundreds of poor children could vanish with so little consequence. The families? They were left with nothing. No graves, no apologies, no restitution. Just faded photographs tucked into plastic sleeves, carried in wallets like talismans against the forgetting. If you travel through the Andes today, you'll hear the echoes. Grandmothers warning children not to talk to strangers. Old men recalling when the marketplace wasn't such a dangerous place. The fear never left. It calcified into culture. And globally, López's story became a grim lesson whispered in criminology lectures, true crime books, and dark documentaries. That evil does not always announce itself with fangs and bloodstains. Sometimes it walks into town with empty pockets, buys bread, and blends in. His legacy is the erosion of trust itself. Trust in strangers, trust in community, trust in justice. In a way, that's worse than the numbers. Because numbers can be debated. But the shiver running down a parent's spine when their child lingers too far at a market stall, that will never be erased. That is López's true inheritance. What do you do with a story like Pedro López's? You can stack the numbers 300, maybe more, like gravestones in your mind until they blur into abstraction. You can rage at the legal systems that folded like paper, or at the governments that chose silence over accountability. But eventually, You're left staring at the abyss of one single truth. The most monstrous thing about Lopez isn't the cruelty he confessed to. It's the ordinariness that contained it. Think about it. No fiery eyes, no grotesque scars, no theatrical villainy. Just a thin man with a quiet demeanor, able to move unnoticed through crowded markets. He was a ghost hiding in plain sight, proof that evil doesn't need spectacle. It just needs opportunity, neglect, and a society distracted enough to look away. And isn't it the real horror? That he wasn't an otherworldly creature, but a product of the world we all live in. Poverty sharpened his invisibility. Bureaucracy enabled his freedom. Indifference gave him room to grow. Lopez wasn't just born, he was assembled piece by piece by every crack in the social fabric. His disappearance after 1998 leaves us dangling in a nightmare without an ending. Maybe he's dead, maybe he's alive. Another face in a nameless crowd. Maybe the bones of more children lie hidden beneath Andean soil, waiting for someone to care enough to dig. Or maybe the greatest tragedy is that we'll never know. The case of Pedro Lopez is a mirror held up to humanity, and the reflection is ugly. We want evil to be loud, theatrical, obvious, so we can spot it, cage it, feel safe again. But Lopez showed us the opposite. Evil can be quiet, polite, unremarkable, and that kind slips past us every time. So the next time you're in a bustling market, surrounded by laughter, color, and chaos, remember, the scariest monsters don't hide in shadows. They stand right beside us, invisible because we refuse to see. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.